Welcome, everybody, to one of our last events of today. Not really, because we have an incredible short film festival that will be in MONAH starting at 5:30, and we are honored to welcome the Quapaw Nation. We have Miss Brooke Beerhouse that did this documentary about the Quapaw Nation bringing buffalo back to regenerate their soil and sustainable agriculture, which ties into our theme of climate change and sustainability. So stick around for that or come on down. But this is the one I've been waiting for. I've had the pleasure to spend time, and not enough time, with these extraordinary women behind me. I want to talk about that, but also I don't want to take up much time before I introduce them. We have one more day, everyone, and we are streaming all around the globe. And we're lucky enough to be live at MONAH this year after 2 years of virtual, hybrid. We are here, and this is the most extraordinary group of people we've had the good fortune to bring together. Now, I would like to introduce Laura Harjo, Paulette Blanchard, and Johnnie Jae, Indigenous Feminism, Freedom for All.
Hi, everybody. We really didn't talk about who was going to talk first, so I'll just kind of jump into it. And we decided we'd really just have a conversation because a lot of people aren't really familiar with Indigenous feminism as a theory, as a concept, as an embodied and lived experience. So I figured we'd just kind of start by just kind of talking about, from our own lens, each of us, what does Indigenous feminism kind of mean to each of us? And I'd like to start with you, Laura.
Why not you?
Because I grabbed the mic first.
Okay. So the way that I come to Indigenous feminism, I really think about it that it's a way of including everybody and everything. So if that means women, children, elders, two-spirit, queer, LGBTQIA, flora, fauna, stars, the spirit world, taking all of those sort of spheres under consideration in the work that you do. So first of all, that's how I come to it. The second way I kind of come to it is thinking about this idea that Joan Hill Chaudhuri, she was a Muskogee author, and she writes about this Muskogee tenet of being in the world, and that all exchanges between entities are transfers of energy. So if we think about how we're interacting with one another, with the natural world, with the spiritual realm, with the stars and the celestial kind of realm, like what's the quality of that interaction? So the other aspect that I think of is how are we in good relations then? So we have all of these different spheres to consider. We have these transfers of energy that are happening. What are the quality of those relations? Are we in good relations? So where I work in Indigenous community planning, then how is one in good relations and thinking collectively, not individualistically, of what one can gain, but what can the collective gain? So another sort of Muskogee value when I think about, Indigenous feminisms is this idea of Anogechka, which means love. And when I talk about love, I'm not talking about this hetero notion of love. I'm talking about love that does caretaking of community. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect then that I think of it is kinship. So how are we in kinship with one another? And from that planning perspective, not thinking about fellow citizens, but what changes when you start thinking about folks like you are in kinship with them. So I think for Native nations, that just really comes naturally because your relatives are probably going to be on tribal council, or they're going to be working for the tribe. So I think sometimes the sort of oppositional politics that we may use, like around civil discourse, those aren't the same kind of protest and kind of having a target within a Native nation. So what does that mean, like, to think differently and think collectively and think in this sort of kinship way? The other kind of aspect that I think of then, so I call that, in my scholarship, I call that Stageotti Sovereignty. So it's this idea, so Stageotti means like indigenous, and it's sovereignty that is grounded and self-determination that is grounded in the people and the community, and it's something that doesn't have to be recognized by a nation state. The other thing is this idea of knowledge, that we have all kinds of knowledge. So, as Paulette said, embodied knowledge. We carry an embodied archive of knowledge. And Johnnie talked about it today when she talked about doing art and not having the words when she was grieving. And so that idea that we have these different knowledges, and that, like, one of the stats for Native women is that 3 in 4 will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. So you have every 3 of, well, let's say 4 Native women standing together, one of them hasn't endured that, but the other 3 have. But maybe they don't have the words to express that, but maybe through art they can express that. And that's a form of knowledge. So that idea of recognizing different kinds of knowledge. And then recognizing different kinds of power. So not authoritative power, not oppositional power, but how can you really think about kinship power and building something together? And then sort of this final kind of idea around Indigenous feminisms is this idea of that folks show up in different geographies. We aren't just in our jurisdictional boundary or our reservation area, that we show up as skateboard crews over here, or like my mom, I wanted her to come, but she has a quilting group on Tuesdays and Thursdays with other Creek women, and she wanted to stay and do that. So like we have these different sort of gatherings, either they're momentary or it's at a material place, at this like a community center, or there's maybe a metaphysical world that, I mean, you can think of it either the spiritual realm, or you can think of it as like in terms of medicine. If you've watched Res Dogs, you can think of it in terms of maybe Sasquatch, or how they kind of blur out the owl's eyes. Like that's what I'm talking about, kind of this metaphysical geography that's going on here. So there are these different kind of ways of understanding. So then if we take this idea of relationality, of that our knowledge surfaces in different ways, and maybe it can't be articulated on a microphone. It has to be articulated through art or some other kind of way, or through drawing a map. And we have power, and we have these different geographies. So if we use that then to weigh in on thinking about sustainability and climate change, like we were kind of having a conversation right before this, and I was just thinking of these extreme weather events and how, like at our stomp grounds, I can see that Muskogee women are really impacted by these extreme weather events. Like it's hot. It is so hot now. At these same moments when I remember being a kid and it wasn't that hot during our ribbon dance. And I've seen in the past couple of decades, women get really sick out there when they're doing the ribbon dance, and either like collapsing or having to like step out. But that idea of like, how do you kind of take their needs and desires under consideration? But this isn't just about women. It's for everybody that gets forgotten. So there's that aspect of it. And when I think about our powwow folks, a lot of times, like, people are there, they're at a powwow, and they're kind of wrapping things up, and these families are on the road traveling. And I know that actually she went to school at Haskell. Her name was Bessie James, and her family was driving home from a powwow, and I guess her mother was ahead of her dad in a van, and there was like this extreme weather event and flash flooding going on. So you have like families and women and people gathering up their kids at the end of these late evening events, and we have flash floods going on. So how can you begin to think about like kind of the social and cultural aspects of how we convene and connect, and how maybe that clashes around these extreme weather events? So the other piece, and I'm going to wrap up, but just it's around mapping, because I'm a mapper. So that's sort of a form of data collection, but often even in Indigenous communities, it's the male elected officials, or it's the men in the community that are weighing in. So like often the way that we're coming to know our land and how we engage in it is a very gendered kind of idea. Maybe it's just around hunting and fishing, but what would it look like if you gathered a group of women elders or young women or two-spirit, non-binary folks, and they're out on the land, and like how are they engaging with it? Maybe they are like convening and talking with the spirit world, or maybe they're gathering wild onions. I don't know. Like, we never map it. We never talk about it. So I guess that's another sort of opportunity that I see of like trying to integrate more perspectives as we're moving forward and building out like what we know about our Indigenous communities using that kind of Indigenous feminist framework. So.
Hold on. Go ahead, John. Go ahead, Johnnie.
Well, I think for me, Indigenous Feminisms is really trying to decolonize like our cultural mindset now. Right. Because before colonization, patriarchy and matriarchy wasn't the way that we think of it now. It wasn't an oppressive thing. Like, we had patriarchal societies, but it didn't mean that men held more power over women or that women were oppressed in their communities. Just the same as if we had matriarchal societies. It didn't mean that women held more power over men or men were oppressed. It just meant that there was a different balance of power and they existed together. So I think now, because of colonization, we have very patriarchal societies in the way that, our governance works. And women are oppressed in our communities now. And so I think with Indigenous feminisms, it's starting to entangle that and to see what's colonization, what values came from that, and what values are actually Indigenous, and what we need to return to kind of restore that balance of power in our communities. Because there are so many Native communities where women can't own land still, where if you marry a non-Native person, then you're no longer can live on your Indigenous lands, but yet a man can marry a non-Native person and still reside on their traditional homelands. And so there's a lot of things like that have come because of colonization that I feel that we need to really untangle. There's a lot of tribes where women aren't allowed to hold positions of leadership. And so, and all of this is because of colonization, because traditionally women have always been the backbones of our societies. There's a proverb that we see shared across social media quite a bit, like, a nation is not defeated until the hearts of its women are on the ground. And that's true because, once women are gone, then there's no one there to, bring forth new nations, to create or nurture those nations. That kind of falls on us as women to carry that. And it's a huge responsibility to not only be kind of like the bearers of life, but also to nurture that life, to nurture the community, to take care of them, and to make sure that they are learning the values that we should be learning. And it's always been on us as women to do that. And even now, as we're addressing issues in our community, women are always the first on the front lines. We're just there. We recognize the problem and we are there. And I kind of laugh now. I mean, it's a joke that we kind of share between women, but it's also true that women will put themselves on the line to raise awareness about different issues in our community. But once it starts picking up notice, then here come the men to kind of swoop in and portray themselves as leaders in this movement, when it was something that was created and led by women and our youth. Yes. But yet men will step in and they will take up the screen time, and they will kind of push women to the background and just make it seem like we're, just kind of side notes in this movement, when women have been out there doing the groundwork, and also behind the scenes doing the policy work as well. And so, you know, I think that's something when we talk about Indigenous feminism that we kind of need to address those inequalities and, you know, just being mindful of the way that we are engaging with each other as men and women, and also making sure that our youth know that they have value and that their voice does matter. And a lot of our tribes are doing that work. You know, we're starting to see a lot of tribes that are starting to create elder councils again. And, you know, creating councils for women where they're able to weigh in. And we're starting to see all this work happening now. And it's a really wonderful thing to see, because it means that we are being mindful that, you know, there is a power inequality within our own communities. And I think that's a huge part of what Indigenous feminism is to me. You know, there's a poet named Scott Woods who had this great poem on racism. And he talks about how racism is something that we take in as easy with every breath that we take. You know, it's just something that we do without even thinking about it. And, you know, I think that when it comes to Indigenous feminisms, it's talking about these systems of oppression that exist and that we interact with on subconscious and very conscious levels, you know, whether it's racism, sexism, you know, all of these are systems of power, and we interact with them daily. And so it's our responsibility, you know, as relatives, as kin, to untangle ourselves from that, to start recognizing what behaviors that we have, the language that we use, even the way that we view each other, like how much of that is rooted in these systems of oppression. And how do we benefit from those systems of oppression? Like, how do we benefit from upholding them and being aware of that? So when it comes to Indigenous feminism, I think it's about untangling ourselves from that and just being really aware of how we interact with each other and the world around us.
Beautiful, both of you. Indigenous feminism for me has been a lot about land, about healing the land, about the relationship with the land. And not just the land itself, but all the beings on it. You know, it's about being the voice for the voiceless, advocating for the things that have been colonized, essentially. You know, you're absolutely right. You know, it's about decolonizing ourselves and each other. It's about reclaiming some of the relationships we've had with our genders, and finding that respect and love and appreciation and value that these diverse genders bring to our communities. It's about advocating for the water and being the voice for the voiceless. You know, it's about being that advocate for the things that have been oppressed. Like, you know, both of these women have really stated beautifully. It's about untangling ourselves from these systems of oppression and violence that have been imposed upon us as Native women, but also, I think, for women in general. You know, the systems that came with patriarchy and with, you know, it's not just paternalism, it's patriarchy, that idea that women are somehow less, when many indigenous communities prior to colonization recognized that women were just as important. There was no less or more. There was equity. There was respect. There was understanding the value that each human being brings to a situation. Everybody's got a specialty, and recognizing that each person's specialty is critical to the diversity, the biodiversity of a community, as well as the biodiversity of land. And I think Indigenous feminism embraces that and really supports that and perpetuates that. And I think that it's going to sometimes mean different things for different people. You know, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for anyone. I think there's different communities are going to have different needs, and I think that Indigenous feminism is that opportunity to fill that need or to address that need, whatever that community's need is. If it's environmental, if it's social, if it's political. I think Indigenous women historically over time have always had a political voice in our community. I know that there have been many communities with women's councils, and I think women's councils are coming back and should, because there's perspectives that are left unheard if we don't. And it's a very valuable perspective, not just as a feminine voice or a two-spirit voice or a non-binary voice, but as a person who is connected to whatever craft that they have, or farming or fishing or hunting or whatever they bring is their superpower, you know? I mean, I think that diversity is a critical component of our societies, of our environment, and of our culture. So for me, Indigenous feminism embraces all of these things, and I think really important component that I really like that you said is uncoupling ourselves from colonization. Another thing that this discussion I'd like to share is how does Indigenous feminism advocate for freedom for all? Or how do you see that Indigenous feminism can contribute to these larger narratives of, like you mentioned, you started to talk about climate change and environmental degradation and stuff. How can Indigenous feminism fit into these kinds of discussions? I'll start with you, Laura.
Well, okay, so freedom for all and thinking about Indigenous feminisms, I guess, I think that it's recognizing that folks are going to come from a range of social locations to thinking about land. So land and place. And in terms of freedom for all, I'm going to nerd out on my methodology part. I just can't help it. And the reason why, it's really rooted in community. So I grew up in the Sapulpa area, and my mom and dad were like members of kind of like the chartered community. So like they're some of the original members. So like just sitting in on meetings with them when I was little, or this would have been the 70s too, when Creek Nation was trying to like gather themselves together after the Self-Determination Act was passed in 75. So just being there and hearing that and seeing my parents, I didn't know the word was community organizers back then, but seeing them be community organizers, but then on the flip side, seeing that in order for you to make some kind of grievance claim, you have to be able to hold a mic and talk for 2 minutes. I was just really bothered by that maybe everybody doesn't want to come up and talk about their world that way. Maybe everybody, they don't have like the words, or they don't want to articulate their experience in that way. So for me, when I think about Indigenous feminisms, I really think about methodology and who you need to, which relatives maybe want to sit and bead and talk about how, I don't know, they can't get enough smoked hide anymore because nobody has access to land because it's all privately owned, and maybe the tribe hasn't set aside any land to be able to hunt or process hide or whatever. I don't know. I'm just like kind of thinking here of like, what are the different sectors of the community that need different kinds of conversations? So then maybe if you're sitting with elders, you're asking them, what changes have you seen happen in the community over time? I mean, you could still ask a little kid that, but an elder is going to have this whole lifetime, which I've had a chance to witness some of these conversations of like, well, this river used to be really wide and now it's really narrow. Or this fish that we've always traditionally caught is now on the endangered species list. So to me, I think really thinking of like who's not included. So, you know, when you're talking about like folks kind of having a craft and not leaving them out. And so one of my classmates at Haskell, he was Two-Spirit, and we were in this class, and we were supposed to be weaving. He's Navajo. But he used to sit with his grandma and twist the ends, and he was really good at it. And I remember being really jealous of him and saying, man, how'd you learn how to twist those ends of your weaving so good? And he's all, hanging out with my grandma. But it's just kind of like, you know, people come with different skills, and we may have our blind spots, but it's like, how do you have these conversations, right? And even like if we're thinking about plants and animals, like maybe we're not able to talk to plants, or we can talk to plants and animals, but like, how do you kind of center plants, animals, spiritual realm, these different realms? How do you factor them in a very agentive way that they have agency and they can like be generative as well? That's kind of the harder question. So like, I know one of my colleagues has cameras set up near the river, and so what she wanted to see is like how they're how different animals are coming to the water and drinking it, so that she can be, I call it being in relationship with knowledge. So she may not know why she's coming to it or have like a hypothesis, but it's like, I just want to watch this and understand. And just, I think that thing of coming to understand different like social locations of different beings. So, I mean, I'll leave it there.
Johnnie?
Well, I think when it comes to like freedom for all, it's kind of understanding like Indigenous people have a whole breadth of knowledge about this land and about how to live in good relationship with the land and this world around us. And so, you know, for me, it's always about trust Native women, trust Black women. Like, we have the answers to a lot of these solutions already if you would just listen. And so much of like white feminism, for example, is very individualistic. It's thinking about what power can I gain for myself. You know, I should be able to do this because a man can do this. I should be able to do this because, you know, just trying to find a way to, you know, be able to say, well, this is what equality is. Like, I could do this too. And it's never really a question of whether or not a woman can or should do it. You know, it's about that balance of power. Why are you doing it? Why do you want to do it? And a good example of this, and I was talking to them about it, because from a pop cultural perspective, like a good way to kind of show that is through the movie Prey, which is the new Predator movie that came out, and it's available in English and Comanche. But so much of that movie I had a problem with when it was first coming out, because it was all about a Comanche woman who goes against gender norms and patriarchal values to become a woman, or to become a warrior. And I took such issue with that because I lived among Comanche women for a good part of my life. And Comanche women are warriors. You know, they're fierce and they're fearless. And, you know, even in the community, like, they're the first ones to start addressing the issues that are going on. They mobilize so quickly and so good. And so I took issue with the way that they were portraying this movie, because I'm like, what? You know, and yes, the Comanche Nation is patriarchal, but again, it wasn't about women being oppressed or not being able to be a warrior. If you had a skill that you could use, you were valued. You got to use that skill. They didn't say, oh, you're a woman, so you can't be a hunter. You know, like, even though you can skin a deer in like 5 minutes, you know, they didn't oppress you. They didn't say no, but it was all about power, you know, and why they weren't doing this. Was there a need for this? There were, you know, traditional gender roles, but it didn't mean that they were less than what a man was doing, you know? So it wasn't necessary. And like, every role that we had in our communities was necessary. And that's the same in the whole world around us. Every role that we have is important, and none is more or less important. And my grandpa used to tell me, you know, like, whether or not you're a janitor or a burger flipper or whatever you do in life, you do it as well as you can, because it's important. And, you know, and I kind of take that to look at when we're looking at Indigenous feminism. It's about learning our place and understanding the role that we are undertaking and what it means to the greater world around us. And in Prey, you know, for her, it was undergoing her katamia, which for the Comanche is a rite of passage. And, you know, they kept asking her, why do you want to be a hunter? And I was telling them about the difference between the version that's in English and in Comanche. In English, it kind of plays into that, her going against patriarchal values, because when she answers, she says, because you don't think I can. And the tone that she delivered and the way that she said it gave the impression that she was doing it strictly because she thought nobody else thought she could. And it was coming from a place of rebellion. And so and she was stubborn about it. But when you watch it in Comanche, instead of saying, you don't think I can, she says, you don't think I will, which gave it a whole new context of this wasn't about them, it was about her. Like, you don't think I can succeed. And, you know, and when it came down to it, it wasn't that they didn't think that she could do it because she was a girl, or that they didn't want her to do it because she was a girl. It was because they knew that she didn't understand what that ceremony and what that rite of passage meant. And they were scared that because she didn't go into it understanding what it meant and what it was, that, you know, she could hurt herself or she could not come back. And this is a family that had already lost their dad. So, of course, they're trying to protect their family unit. But it comes through the lens that you're seeing this through. If you're a Native person watching this in Comanche or even English, you automatically start seeing the difference. What's, you know, like a European lens of equality and then the Indigenous lens of equality. And there's a difference. So when it comes to like Indigenous feminism, it's about understanding that power that we have inherently as women, and also like the power that men have inherently. You know, there's some tribes where, you know, we hear, like if you're talking to a non-native and you tell them that you're not allowed to sing at the drum, you know, they think automatically that it's because you're a woman, like this is a form of oppression. But they don't realize that for a lot of tribes, you're not allowed to be at that drum because of the power that you hold as a woman will, you know, overtake the power, that it throws off the balance of power. And so there's a reason that, you know, women do certain things in like certain ceremonies, certain traditions, and there's a reason that men do it too. It's not necessarily oppression, it's just because it's respecting the power that we bring to the table as women. And, you know, it's really interesting to learn that too, you know, like what drums can you touch? You know, like there's a lot of women who are allowed to do hand drums, but they're not allowed to drum at the big drums. And a lot of that is because of that power. And it's understanding that it's very different for us as Native women. Now, where we are oppressed as Native women, I think, is when it comes to modesty. Because modesty has always been a traditional value, but it's been very Christianized. And so now when we talk about modesty, it's about covering ourselves up. And let me tell you where I learned about this, because I've always had a problem with our Choctaw regalia, because it's very colonial. It's like a colonial dress, long sleeves, long skirt, and it comes up to your neck. And so like I was kind of laughing. I was telling my cousin, like, you know, I don't think I want to dress like traditional Choctaw until we can decolonize our regalia. And so like I started asking her, like, well, what was our traditional regalia? And she's like, you know, I don't really know. So let me look into this. And I was like, okay. So she got back to me and she's like, Johnnie, she's like, well, here's the thing. She's like, we used to wear the long skirts. And she goes, and she was telling me the different materials. They used to use turkey feathers. They used to do like different leaves and bark to make our skirts. She's like, but for the most part, we were topless. And she goes, and we had long necklaces on. And I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to wait on that regalia. It's like, I'm not that brave yet. But, you know, I started to realize, too, like, you know, our idea of modesty has been very skewed. You know, we have Native women now, you know, if, like, with ribbon skirts are a big topic right now, you know, and, you know, there are some Natives who, if they see the way that they've been modified for Native fashion, you know, they make them short, or, you know, they decorate them in different ways. You know, some people are telling them like, well, that's not traditional, that's not modest, that's not this. And it's like, you know, well, we're modern Indigenous people, and, you know, our fashion evolves. And, you know, like, it's not like they're wearing like the short skirts in ceremony. You know, it's more of a fashion statement. Like, there's a difference in the way that it's being used. But I also see, you know, if a young woman posts a picture of herself, there's so many people that will jump on that and be like, that's not modest. You know, you're showing, why aren't you covered up? And, you know, I saw a picture of one of my friends who was just, you know, she had shorts and a tank top on, and she was on a motorcycle. And there were women, Native women, who were on her comments telling her that she was contributing to the murdered and missing Indigenous women by sexualizing Native women. And, you know, and I was sitting there like, that doesn't sit right with me, because yes, Native women are hypersexualized. Yes, the images that you see of Native women are hypersexualized, but that doesn't mean that the way that we dress, the way that we engage with the world is inherently hypersexual. And, you know, we should be able to wear shorts. We should be able to wear a t-shirt or a tank top and not be sexualized. Because there was a time when we were running around topless and not being sexualized, you know, where, you know, that, I mean, it's hot in these areas, and a lot of our tribes did go topless. But women weren't looked on as, it wasn't looked on as being sexual. It was just existing day to day. So when it comes to Indigenous feminism, it's about having those discussions, finding the balance, and helping to understand that it's not on us as women. Like, we don't need to change the way that we behave or the way that we engage with the world. It's about changing the way the world engages with not just Native women, but all women, and understanding that they're human beings, and that, you know, the way that they exist in the world isn't necessarily for a sexual existence, but yet that's the way women are kind of idealized in the world. And, you know, and not just Native women, you know, all women. You could be walking down the street and you could be covered head to toe and there's somebody catcalling you, you know. So it's not about what we wear. It's not about how we engage with the world. It's how the world engages with us and how they value women, and the way that they see our value, not just as women, but as human beings in the world. So when I think of Indigenous feminism and how it contributes to freedom for all, it's understanding that we need to reevaluate the way that we relate to each other, the way we view each other, and the way we view equality and equity, and even just womanhood in general. You know, it's very diverse. It's not a binary world that we have. So it's also being mindful of that, and, you know, just really trying to figure out like what the work that we're doing to kind of change that balance of power, that we're also making sure that, you know, people outside of our communities are understanding that for us, it's not about us gaining power. It's about us restoring a balance of power, because we have power as Native women and we understand that power. And so it's about us learning how to use that power in the greater like landscape, and, you know, also like trying to help other women who aren't Native, you know, who have this very individualistic idea of what freedom is, of what power and equity is. You know, a lot of them, it's for a lot of people, you know, on a subconscious level, they're not necessarily looking for liberation. They're looking to have the power of the oppressor, and, you know, not looking to liberate from that. They're looking to gain that power for themselves. And it's not necessarily the way they see it, but that's exactly what they're doing. So it's kind of helping them understand that there's a difference between liberation and just gaining the power of the oppressor, and that we need to be very conscious of that, because, you know, unless you're considering every single person in every single community, what progress you make in your community can come at the expense of another community, even without realizing it. Which is why, for me, I think in conversations like this, you know, we always need to be centering Indigenous and Black perspectives, because that's where liberation in this country is going to start and where it should start. Otherwise, it's always going to be at our expense.
Wow, that was powerful. Freedom for all kind of reminds me, you guys have been talking about these different concepts, and while you were speaking about a couple of points, one of the things that came up for me was I was thinking about Madonna Thunderhawk and the Sovereignty School, and how during AIM, you know, what Madonna Thunderhawk is part of a project called where women were the backbone and men were the jawbone. And she talks about the AIM movement and how men were on TV, men were the ones up front, men had all the publicity, but it was women who were teaching the children, Madonna Thunderhawk, teaching the children about what sovereignty meant, and how sovereignty looks through all of these different lenses of food, of politics, of community, of culture. And it was important, and it was drilled into these kids what sovereignty was about and why it was important. It wasn't just, you know, it wasn't just school learning about math and English. It was school learning about your rights as a being, your rights as a human being, and your responsibilities that come with that. Those responsibilities to your, not resources, but your relatives, Dan Wildcat says all the time, you don't have a right to clean water. You don't have a right to clean air. You don't have a right to clean soil. You have a responsibility to those things. And we need to have a relationship that is such that these are relatives, right? And so to me, Madonna Thunderhawk reminded me that, we just do. We don't wonder if somebody thinks we can, but that we just do things that are required, because women are the last stronghold to our communities. Just like bison, when there's a threat to the herd, the males are on the outside circle. The babies are in the center, and the females are the last line of resistance to get to those children, to those young bison. And Native women are very much like that. We are the last line of defense to protect our future, to protect our knowledges, to protect our families, we protect our men. We are vicious when it comes down to having to protect what's loved. And I think that Freedom for All kind of represents this idea of everybody has a right or a responsibility to place, to each other, to the environment. We've taken these relationships for granted, or we've lost relationship and taken these responsibilities for granted and not owned up to what we inherently should, which is being a good relative, being a good ancestor, advocating for the voiceless. When I listened to Dr. Hernandez's discussion earlier about what's happening to the indigenous women in Guatemala, it tore my heart up. It was tragic because we understand that story. It's our story too. We've already been there. We've already done that, and we're trying to recuperate from that, and we're still fighting colonization. We're still fighting the rich. We're still fighting for land back, which, Indigenous feminism comes back to that relationship with our land, with each other, with our place, understanding the personality of place so well that it's part of who our personality is too, part of our identity, part of, we each have sacred places we find that are special, that are important, that are relevant to our being, and protecting those places with the utmost fierceness because we love them. We love our rivers. My home river is the Yuba River in Northern California, because I grew up swimming in that river and exploring and fishing and just being free, being a child allowed to be free in an environment. My mountain is the Sierra Butte. It was the most amazing monolith in the region, and it made no sense that this giant chunk of ocean rock jutted out of the granite mountains, and it's sacred to me. And I think that, for me, is what I would fight for, is to protect these beautiful places that have a right to exist, that we don't have a right to impede on the water's right to return to the sea, the raindrops' right to return to the sea, that we should somehow or another find a balance, and we need to return to that balance, find that relationship and nurture it again. And the Indigenous feminism is very much about that gap that is missing in our society today, which is care. Nurture and care have been absent, and we need to come back to those basic emotions, because our children are not being taught to care in school. It is the parents' responsibility, and somewhere along the past couple of generations, it's gotten lost in some families. And children, care is taught. we're born wanting to care, but not knowing how to, and we have to be shown how to care. And I think that's something that Indigenous feminism can help with, is that it reminds us that we have a responsibility to the relationships of place with each other, because without each other, we will cease to exist. We are herd animals, humans, and we need to somehow or another teach each other how to care again, and that starts with an individual. It starts with us, with each of us, learning to remembering somehow, or sometimes to care. And COVID didn't help that any way, shape, or form, mind you. And in some ways, it did. You know, it made us realize the delicateness of life and the value of those relationships, because I adore these women, and I'm so excited to have been able to spend time just sitting around in a circle talking about what, and listening to their understandings of Indigenous feminism has broadened my own understandings of Indigenous feminism. And I think that is solid and beautiful, and I'm really grateful for you guys being here to experience your own understandings of our perspectives of Indigenous feminism. So in speaking about that again, what are some of the things society you think could do going forward that might, I don't know, enhance our social construct or our society?
I think it's listening. You know, because so much of the problems that we have in this world are a lack of communication, a lack of being able to communicate with each other and really understand each other. Like, we don't really have a lot of interaction with each other, and especially, you know, as Native communities, because we're so rural for a lot of our communities, and then of course we're dealing with erasure. So even, you know, for urban natives, you know, that are right next door to everybody, you know, we're very invisible. And so a lot of people don't realize that we are still here and they don't understand that we exist, and that the issues and problems that we have, you know, exist. And when they do know that those problems exist, for some reason, because they don't have much interaction with us as human beings, as neighbors, as people, as teachers, as, you know, just day-to-day people, those issues become synonymous with our identity, and they reinforce a lot of these stereotypes and a lot of the misinformation that people have about who Native people are. It reinforces that. And so, you know, in everything that we do as Native people, like, we have to contend with those stereotypes. We have to overcome them. So, like, when we go to the doctor, it's not just a matter of, you know, getting treatment. It's overcoming those stereotypes in order for our humanity to be recognized, so that they can see that we are a human being in need. Because, you know, we just don't have a lot of interaction with each other. So it's about trying to listen and understand, and see where we're coming from as, you know, as people, and understanding that we're all in this together. You know, like Paulette said, like, our survival depends on each other. Like, we need each other, every single one of us. So I think that's one of the things that society can do, is just learn to listen.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I think about is, what would it look like if we created communities, spaces, cities for Indigenous women, Indigenous Two-Spirit folks, Indigenous disabled folks? Like, what would it look like to have a community like that? Because it wouldn't just be good for the list of folks I just named off. It would be good for everybody, right? So when I think about that, again, I come to this as a community planner. So what would it look like to create a community where, you know, they're doing LEED certified stuff anyway? So how can you also build in the needs of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit and disabled folks, right? So then that might look like, what does transportation look like? If you know that maybe people don't sort of fall in line with like a heteronormative household, and maybe it's a single parent household and it's a mom chaining all these things in a day's trip to drop off kids, to pick up groceries, to go to school, to go pick up her kid and take him to the doctor or whatever, and she has to do this all while riding a bus. What does that look like? How do things look different? Either the bus stop, or do we reconceive what that transportation looks like? Or for the person that has mobility concerns and maybe they have to, there's only like 2 handicap spaces and they have to get to work early so that they can get that spot so that they can get into their building to work. But they can't leave all day, because if they leave to go to lunch, then they're going to lose their spot. So what does it start to look like when we take those sort of concerns under consideration? Because there's already money being put into sustainability and creating like these futures. But what does it mean to have a future that includes folks that we haven't explicitly centered and explicitly said, this is a safe space, this is a brave space in a city for Indigenous women, elders, children, Two-Spirit, disabled folks? What do those spaces start to look like? Can you start to stack some of the things that you need in one place? So like, you know, I was listening to you talk about some of like around health and having accessibility to healthcare. What does it look like to have healthcare? You know, this morning there was a question about mental health and what does that look like in sort of Indian country? Well, in Indian country, what it has looked like is that we have informal governance systems. We have formal governance systems, but the informal governance systems look like, how are we creating our everyday lives and living them? So does it look like what my mom's doing? She's with a bunch of ladies, they're making a quilt and they're gonna have a drawing and give it away to an elder. So what, you know, like what does something like that look like? The everyday sort of lived experience. How does that weigh in on how we're thinking of a future and creating spaces where people can convene and do this sort of informal governance, and that's a form of caretaking. So Indigenous feminist Diane Millian, she talks about this, and she implicates kind of the neoliberal individualistic system of healthcare and how the onus is upon the individual to seek healthcare. Within Indigenous societies, the onus is upon the collective to surround and caretake that person. So Diane Millian talks about that, but she also talks about sort of these seafaring canoe journeys where youth can be a part of that and they see a place of belonging. And, you know, I see like things like Indigenous Comic Con and is it X-Pop or what's
Indigenous Pop X?
Indigenous Pop X, that those are the places for the geeks and the nerds and the goth and the punk kids. So and that's Indigenous feminism. So how do we kind of create that? Anyway.
Well, with that, I'm just going to say thank you, and thank you both very much. This was an incredible conversation. I have so much to walk away with, and I'm grateful for your wisdom and your stories. And thank you all for coming, and have a great evening. Are there any questions before we go?
Okay, I'm a woman. I'm white. The things that you said about spirituality and honoring the earth really get to me. And my question is, if I want to share my experience, we're transplanted from a different continent, from a different land, but we're here, and we need to connect with this land. Do y'all have any clues about how us clueless people can connect to the place where we live finally at long last?
You came from somewhere originally, correct? So you were indigenous to somewhere. So
Europe.
Connect with that. You know, paganism was an earth-based religion. It was in love with the earth, and it treasured and worshipped the earth. There's not a thing wrong with that. I think it's quite a beautiful culture and spirituality in itself.
Well, but, you know, I just wonder, are we resonant, you know, if we do that is, I feel like, is for the land and the resonance of the plants and animals and everything that's going on. That's for over there, and I feel like you don't feel like we have to. Not your way, our way.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
Way.
Take your culture and rebuild a relationship with the places and the plants and the animals here.
Yeah, because, you know, I think as everybody, like, we have a responsibility to learn about who we are and, you know, go back to our inherent identities because, you know, for me, white people are like the poster child of what happens when assimilation wins, when these genocidal policies win, because a lot of people here have literally been stripped of their languages, their inherent identities, their connection to who they are. And so I feel a lot of people here, you know, for me, I feel a lot of white people are lost, you know, and they're searching for something to connect to. Absolutely. And that's why they tend to kind of gravitate towards indigenous ways of being, like in indigenous communities. And they don't necessarily know how to engage with us. And so, you know, they kind of try and form like a hodgepodge, like to do their, you know, to honor like their own culture, but also ours. And it ends up kind of messy because they don't really know who they are first. So, you know, for me, I think Paulette's absolutely right. Like, you got to connect with your inherent identity first. Understand who you are, your culture, and the relationship that your people had with the land from where you came from, because that's going to help you better understand how to build a relationship in the land that you now reside in.
Okay. No instructions, huh?
Well, well, that's the kind of the hard part, right?
That's very white of me,
right? Because let me tell you, you know, I help people, like, I try to help people reconnect with who they are, you know, because we have a lot of natives who are disconnected from their culture and their communities. So I try to find ways to help them rebuild those connections. And it's really hard to do because sometimes you don't know where to start. And so, like, you know, for us, it's going back and learning who your people are, like going through your ancestry, trying to find out, like, where did they come from and why did they come here? Because once you understand, like, the answers to those questions, then you're better able to understand how it is you fit here and why it is you are here or where you're in the place that you're at. But you have to go back to the beginning and understand, you know, exactly what led you here. And so, and it's not easy, and it's a hard journey for a lot of people because there's so many reasons that they will hit a roadblock where they don't know, you know, more than like 2 generations back where they came from. You know, there's a lot of reasons that they have lost ancestors themselves. So, you know, it's really difficult, but it's possible to just kind of go back as far as you can and start trying to figure out, okay, well, if I can't go back any further than 2 generations, why is that? And what do I need to reconcile with, like, in a historical context of why you can't go back more than 2 generations to understand, you know, the relationship that you have with this land and what history happened to your family before they got here and once they got here, because it didn't end once they got here. Like, you know, a lot of people tend to think they came here and they found that American dream, but that's not the reality for a lot of families. They came here and they found more struggle and different struggles. So I think it's really about going back and just trying to find out as much as you can and just trying to reconcile with that history before you create a new history or try to create a new history somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. By the way, this is pretty wonderful.
Thank you all so much, you powerful women.